The Ordering of Sleeping and Waking on Audio Digest Psychiatry, Volume 23, Number 14, addressing chronobiology and the effects of light and melatonin. Alfred J. Lewy, Professor of Psychiatry, Ophthalmology, and Pharmacology at Oregon Health Sciences University, Portland, is guest lecturer on this issue. Dr. Lewy?
Melatonin is derived from serotonin. Interestingly, serotonin concentrations in the pineal are higher than anywhere else in the body. And of course, melatonin is exclusively made in the pineal gland. Now, most critters have pineals, most vertebrate critters, and sunlight exposure directly suppresses melatonin production, so that melatonin is never made during the day. It's only made during nighttime darkness. Even if you were to go into a cave during the day, you would not get melatonin production. It's shut off entirely for the day by two mechanisms that I'll talk about in a second. The pineal is calcified in humans, and for many years its only function was thought to be of help to radiologists to show the midline. Calcification does not affect melatonin production. Even though melatonin decreases with age and calcification increases, these are not connected events. Now, humans remain connected to the light-dark cycle, even though their pineal is located in the middle of the brain where it cannot directly get light exposure because light cannot pass all the way through into the middle of the brain. The connection is a very carefully worked out neural pathway. The heart of this pathway is in the hypothalamus. It's the location of the biological clock, and it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or it's a paired structure, nuclei. We abbreviate it SCN. And the SCN sends out a circadian, or approximately 24-hour signal that drives not only the rhythm of melatonin production, but all circadian rhythms. Every single one that we know of is probably controlled by one master circadian pacemaker located in the SCN. For melatonin and the pineal production of melatonin, we know the exact pathway emanating from the SCN. This is not true for some of the other circadian rhythms like cortisol and body temperature, but we know about melatonin. It goes to the lateral hypothalamus, and then it goes through the medial forebrain bundle, through the spinal cord sympathetic outflow. And indeed, the pineal is a peripherally innervated organ. It is innervated by postganglionic sympathetic neurons. The ganglia is in the superior cervical ganglia. And norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter released at the end of those neurons, and they stimulate beta-1 adrenergic receptors. And that makes the pineal make melatonin. Now, the SCN is entrained or synchronized to the light-dark cycle by another carefully worked-out pathway, the retinohypothalamic tract. The RHT conveys photic information from the retina to the hypothalamus. This pathway is separate from the visual pathway. So it is possible to be visually blind or cortically blind and still have circadian sight, and vice versa. Now, when the norepinephrine stimulates beta-1 receptors, it begins a cascading sequence of events that help win the Nobel Prize for Julius Axelrod at the NIMH. Steve Reppert has recently cloned the receptor for melatonin. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But some of his earlier work with Dave Klein showed in monkey CSF studies the typical nighttime rise and daytime fall of melatonin production. Interrupting the night with a pulse of light caused an abrupt cessation of melatonin production. Returning the animal to darkness, the levels pop back up to where they were before they turned the lights on, and the levels falling the next day and rising the next night. And this effect has been demonstrated over and over again in both diurnal and nocturnal species. One effect of light unique to melatonin production is acute suppression. Nighttime rise and daytime fall of melatonin production. Then the lights were left on for several days, cessation of melatonin production. Then the lights were left off for several days. There is still an on phase of about 12 hours and an off phase of about 12 hours, but it's only approximately 12 hours, and the total is only approximately 24. This is the circadian rhythm of the SCN non-synchronized or non-entrained to the light-dark cycle. So the clock does not need the light-dark cycle to run. It runs endogenously. It's self-generated. It needs the light-dark cycle to have this precise 24-hour rhythm. Now, in the late 70s, it was generally thought that humans were not affected by light. And one reason is that we would wake people up in the middle of the night to try and suppress melatonin with light, and there would be no suppression. Then we discovered, and published it in 1980, that light about 5 times brighter than indoor light will suppress human melatonin production. Levels are coming down to near daytime values. Turn the lights off, they pop back up to where they were before we turned the lights on. This is between 2 and 4 in the morning when this study was done. Ordinary room light has very little suppressant effect. In the same study, we had a hint of a dose-response or fluence-response relationship in that an intermediate intensity of 1500 lux caused intermediate suppression between that of 500 and that of 2500 lux. So the brighter the light, the greater the suppression of melatonin production. We've also looked at the wavelengths that are important for suppressing melatonin. It's blue-green light, closer to the green, and this is most effective in suppressing melatonin production. It's 509 nanometers. Why is that of interest? Well, it's not really that important. Most white light sources contain 509 nanometers. It's right in the middle of the visual spectrum. Rods are activated by that wavelength, and rhodopsin is, so that's of interest. We've used green light, and green light is more effective than white light. It's a little weird for our patients, so we don't generally use it in therapeutic procedures, but you can get away with about half the intensity of light if you focus in on the correct wavelength. Well, our findings published in Science in 1980 had 2 major implications. One was that humans may have circadian biological rhythms cued to the 24-hour rhythm of sunlight and seasonal biological rhythms cued to the annual change in day length, relatively unperturbed by the use of ordinary intensity indoor light. In other words, we might have the same biological responses to light as do other animals, except that we require brighter light and therefore sunlight, which is much brighter generally than indoor light, for these responses. Furthermore, in the winter, when we turn our electric lights on at 5 in the afternoon till we go to bed at 11, we're not giving ourselves a long day. The light isn't bright enough. We're still going to be responding to the short winter day compared to the long natural day in the summer. Similarly, if we get up in the middle of the night and flick on the bathroom lights, we're not going to reset our 24-hour rhythms. That light, the bathroom light, is not bright enough to reset our clock. We're going to respond to the 24-hour rhythm in sunlight and darkness. The second implication was that we might substitute experimentally bright artificial light for sunlight to possibly therapeutically manipulate biological rhythms in humans. Some of the manifold rhythms in nature of seasonal biological rhythms. We have bird migration. Monarch butterflies, by the way, migrate also. We have hibernation. And the major one is the estrus cycle. There are fall breeders, there are spring breeders, all geared according to gestation length to deliver the young in the most favorable time of the year in the spring. The further away from the equator, the greater is the difference in day length between the shortest day of the year and the longest. And of course, over in this latitude, the nights are twice as long in the winter as in the summer, twice as long at the solstices. That means twice the duration of melatonin production, which is made only at night. And it is the duration and possibly the phase of melatonin production that controls most seasonal rhythms in animals. This feature of melatonin goes back evolutionarily to the earliest organisms on Earth, the red tide. It is made by one of the algae called Goniolix polyhedra. In the fall, it goes into a cyst form, and through the winter. This seasonal rhythm in this one-celled organism is thought to be controlled by melatonin production, which occurs only at night in the dark in this one-celled organism, just as it does up through our own species. This organism also has a circadian rhythm in bioluminescence, and there is a circadian rhythm known for 40 years now in this feature of Goniolix polyhedra, also thought to be controlled by the 24-hour rhythm of melatonin production. Now, humans have been interested in day length as well, and one of the theories explaining Stonehenge is that for agricultural or more likely religious reasons, these were sun worshippers, 3000 BC, so our Britannic Bronze Age ancestors were interested in day length, and we became interested in day length when Mr. Herbert Kern came to us in 1979 after reading about our ability to measure melatonin in humans, asking for some melatonin assays to be done on himself. Why? Because he said that he got depressed every winter. And he's an engineer and gave us the records of the past 13 years, which we double plotted, and indeed basically confirmed that when the days were short he was depressed, and when they grew longer again in the spring he came out of his depressions. So in the winter of 1980 we said, instead of measuring your melatonin, we just discovered that bright light can regulate melatonin production. Perhaps it can regulate your seasonal rhythm here. And so in the first week of December, a few months before he was due to switch spontaneously out of his depression, we gave him light therapy, the first such patient, at least the first such winter depressive patient. There's nothing special about this fixture. It's important that they're portable because we take advantage of the inverse square law. The closer to the light source you are, the brighter it is. Actually, it's the inverse of the square of the distance between you and the light source that is related to intensity. So that if you're 4 feet away from a light source and then you move to be 2 feet away from the light source, you have now got 4 times the light intensity as 4 feet away. So the light sources there's ordinary fluorescent light, but they must be calibrated. You must be given a certain distance from the light source to know what the intensity is. And basically we're using 2500 lux to 10,000 lux to treat people. If you use the brighter light, you don't have to have quite as long a duration. And the light is coming in from a 45-degree angle from the side. We don't ask our patients to stare directly at the light, but rather to scan their eyes once or twice a minute across the light fixture for a few seconds. The eyes must be open. If you close your eyes, you will cut off 70% of the light, and it must be a certain intensity. So that's how we do light therapy. And with Mr. Kern, we wanted to make sure that the light intensity was bright enough to suppress melatonin, so we tested it in the middle of the night, and it was bright enough to do that. But we didn't treat him with the light in the middle of the night. In fact, it was not even our intention to suppress melatonin when we actually treated him. Animals tell day length between the time interval of dawn and dusk. They don't need light in the middle of the day, and they don't need the light in the middle of the night. This is a logarithmic scale of light intensity. 200 lux for ordinary room light, 2,000 lux for bright artificial light for our light therapy, 10,000 for a cloudy day, 100,000 for a sunny day. And for Mr. Kern, we gave him the light between 6 and 9 in the morning and 4 and 7 in the afternoon, so as to change an 8.5-hour long day to a 13-hour long day. We're well below what can be obtained on a bright sunny day. Even a cloudy day has, as I say, 10,000 lux out there. You don't need a camera with a flash to take a picture on a cloudy day. It's still bright enough to be effective. So it's not the clouds in the northern parts of the country that relate to winter depression, it's the short day. Well, after 3 or 4 days, Mr. Kern switched out of his depression either by his own self-depressive ratings or the nurses' ratings. And this turns out to be a major feature of treating winter depression. It takes about 3 or 4 days before you see an effect. And the effect is usually complete within 1 to 2 weeks. With Mr. Kern, we treated him for 10 days. That was only an N=1 study, and of course Mr. Kern earned himself a second authorship on the case report. It wasn't double-blind or anything like that. But it did inspire us to go ahead the next year with the first controlled study, and at this point I left the NIH, came to Portland, and Norm Rosenthal took over the light studies, and he conducted the first controlled study. There was a dim yellow light given morning and late afternoon versus a bright white light. There was no change before and after the dim yellow light. The bright white light caused a significant reduction in depression ratings. And the patients thought that the dim yellow light was the active light, so we felt that at that point in time it was a good placebo control. Since then, as you can see from the exhibit hall, light therapy has become a major factor in psychiatry. The DSM-4 has, as well as 3R, has winter depression in the list of disorders, and we have a society for light therapy now that's got 400 members from 16 different countries. We're meeting in a month in Washington, D.C. as a satellite to the CINP. Now, Norm coined the term seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, and also did some of the first demographic studies. It tends to come fairly early in life, perhaps even in childhood, where it can mask as school phobia. And the sex ratio is around 4 or 5 to 1. As you get older, it may actually decrease. Certainly after the age of menopause, the sex ratio appears to even out 1 to 1. These people gain weight in the winter and prefer carbohydrates, whereas they switch their preference to fruits and vegetables in the spring and summer. Some of these people actually have 2 different size wardrobes, one larger size for winter clothes and smaller size for summer clothes. Some unfortunate people don't lose their weight in the summer, but they don't gain weight in the summer. Weight gaining time is in the winter. The cardinal symptom is lack of energy in the winter. Despite the fact that these people are generally sleeping more, as much as 3 hours longer sleep time in the winter than in the summer. But they're not well rested, and this accounts for what I think is the subsyndromal variety. It's thought that about 5% of North Americans have the clinically severe form, and another 15% have the subsyndromal form, all of which are treatable by light, but of that 15% you may not want to bother with treatment. In that subsyndromal type, I've got an artist patient on the Oregon coast who likes to feel as inspired and as creative in the summer as in the winter, so she uses light therapy throughout the winter. I've got another gentleman who is self-employed. He's a salesman, and if he doesn't use light therapy, he doesn't make any money in the winter. So there are these subsyndromal types that benefit from light therapy. It's generally not a very severe form of depression. We occasionally see some suicidal hospitalized patients, but that's rare, even in the more severe clinical form. Now, one of the cardinal features of this lack of energy, this difficulty getting out of bed, is morning hypersomnia. And this gave us a clue that maybe there is a circadian rhythm component to winter depression, that I'll get into in a moment. But first I want to go into a little bit of the basic physiology of circadian rhythms. All of our research in humans stems from animal studies in this particular area. And I want to talk about the importance of the timing of chronobiologically active light. I've already discussed intensity and wavelength and want to concentrate on timing. I want to define the terms phase advance and phase delay. A phase advance is a shift to an earlier time. A phase delay is a shift to a later time. Phase means time. The body temperature minimum normally occurs around 3 in the morning. And if we were to shift it to 1 in the morning, that's a phase advance, and if we were to shift it to 3 in the morning, that's a phase delay. I also want to define what a free running rhythm is on a 24-hour scale, double plotted. If you plot the activity rest cycle, it'll fall vertically in a straight line, directly downwards. If the animal has a tau, that's the Greek for time or period, greater than 24 hours, it will drift to the right. If it has a periodicity shorter than 24 hours, it will drift to the left. Now, in rats who are free running in constant darkness and activity wheels, and a pulse of light is given, a short pulse of light, it will either not have an effect or will have one of 2 effects depending on when the light pulse occurs. The light pulse occurs during the subjective day. Even though it's constant dark, the animal still has if it's nocturnal, then subjective day is when it's asleep, and subjective night is when it's active. The pulse occurs during subjective day, the animal makes no phase shift. The pulse of light occurs near the first half of subjective night. It makes a phase delay. And the later in that first half of the night the light pulse occurs, the greater is the magnitude of the phase delay shift. Anthropomorphically speaking, it's almost as if the animal thinks this one pulse of light is the new dusk, and the later it sees dusk, the later it resets its clock. If, however, the pulse of light occurs in the second half of subjective night, the animal thinks that this pulse of light is dawn and makes a phase advance shift. The earlier the pulse occurs, the greater is the magnitude of the phase advance shift. So we plot these on what we call a phase response curve, and if you come away with anything from my part of the talks today, the phase response curve is what I want you to understand. And it's simply a plot. All it is a mathematical plot. It doesn't really exist. It's just a description of how we respond to light. And this is true for nocturnal animals, diurnal animals, and humans, if it's bright light. On a PRC, or phase response curve, we plot the advanced responses above the horizontal axis, the delay responses below, and of those 5 experiments I just described, you see the dead zone of no responses in the middle of the day, delay responses of increasing magnitude in the first half of the night, a crossover or inflection point in the middle of the night, and advanced responses. They are greater towards the middle and lesser towards the end of the night. Now, what does this curve tell us? Well, it tells us several things. Don't give light in the middle of the day. It's not going to shift the clock. If you give light in the middle of the night, be careful, because if you are just a few minutes too early or too late, you could be getting a phase shift of several hours in one direction or the opposite direction that you desire. So in treating people, we give them light where we know it will have a definite effect. In the evening, to cause a phase delay. In the morning, to cause a phase advance. I'll go over that again. Morning light phase advances the clock, shifts it to an earlier time. And one way of remembering that is morning light helps you get up earlier. Evening light phase delays the clock, shifts it to a later time. One way to remember that, evening light helps you stay up later. And that's how we use light to reset the clock in one direction or the other. So we have proposed that there are 2 logical types of circadian phase disorders. One type, the phase advance type, was first hypothesized by Dr. Kripke, who is going to be talking to you a little bit later, with respect to the non-seasonal depressives, the people who have early morning awakening. Another type, the phase delay type, we think applies to the winter depressives who have morning hypersomnia. If you've got somebody who you think is phase delayed and you want to treat them by phase advancing them, you give them bright light in the morning, you avoid it in the evening. If you want to phase delay somebody who is abnormally phase advanced, you give them the bright light in the evening and avoid it in the morning. So we've established, I hope, that winter depression is not really related to Christmas. In Australia, they have Christmas blues at one time of the year and winter depression 6 months later. As I mentioned earlier, the phase advanced type of depression is thought to be the non-seasonal type, characterized by early morning awakening and a number of features that differentiate it from winter depression, a number of clinical and biological features. Winter depression is characterized by phase delayed sleep, at least, and therefore we thought phase delayed circadian rhythms. Our first test of the phase delay or phase shift hypothesis was in 1985. We studied 8 patients and 7 control subjects in a 4-week protocol. They had all shared the same light-dark and sleep-wake cycles. They were crossed over between morning and late evening light because we wanted to phase delay them now with the evening light, and given a week of light at both times. Our protocol giving either morning light, 6 to 8 a.m., evening light, 8 to 10 p.m. This is how we avoid light. These are welder's goggles. I got stopped at Heathrow Airport treating my jet lag with these goggles and searched rather carefully. 1985. And now we have very attractive ones. Well, our first question was, do winter depressive patients preferentially respond to morning light? Our depression ratings fell significantly. The mean rating was significantly lower with the morning light compared to baseline. The evening light, no difference. The combination of morning plus evening light showed an intermediate effect between that of morning light alone and that of evening light alone, as if when given together, morning and evening light counteract each other, which they do. One causes a phase advance, one a phase delay. Now, are they responding to morning light because they're phase delayed? Here's how we measure phase. Melatonin production under dim light so as not to suppress it. We draw blood every half hour. In the evening, Levels are low during the day, high at night, so in the evening is the time of rise. That's the melatonin onset. When it crosses the 10 picogram per mil threshold, that's the DLMO, D-L-M-O, or dim light melatonin onset. And the mean melatonin onsets in our patients compared to controls after the baseline week was significantly delayed. The morning light phase advanced them to a normal time. So this fulfills criteria for a state-dependent marker for winter depression. Phase delay when depressed, normal phase when coming out of their depression. In another study, we looked at the correlation between advancing their clocks and depression ratings, comparing a half an hour to 2 hours of morning light and some baseline weeks. We found the earlier we advanced them, the lower the depression rating, and this was a significant correlation. So our conclusions were that morning light for most people is more effective than evening light, that there's no reason to give both morning and evening light. They're just going to counteract each other's phase shifts. That these winter depressives are seasonal, yes, but the mechanism is circadian. It's a phase delay that is causing the depression. Not making them depressed per se, but in susceptible individuals, it's the winter time cue. And by changing the winter time cue to a summertime cue, we can take them out of their depressions. What makes them actually depressed is a topic of further research. Well, now some practical things about treating winter depression. When you have a patient, take a sleep-wake history and a light exposure history. I had a patient who said that she was suicidal because she always came out of our winter depression March 7th of every year, and here it was March 21st, and she was still depressed. And was she going to stay depressed the rest of her life? Of course, she was thinking very depressed thoughts then.
Dr. Lewy's remarks continue on Side B. Side B, Audio Digest Psychiatry, Volume 23, Number 14, returns to Alfred J. Lewy on treating winter depression.
And I asked her if anything had changed, and she said, well, yeah, I did move to a basement apartment where the light exposure in the morning was now later, and you needed a later date to get earlier light to bring her out of her depression. Outdoor light, we can treat people. You don't have to buy a light fixture. If you're a person of means and you don't need to work, just delay your sleep. I'll go into that a little bit later. As long as you're waking up into the sunlight and you're going outside and getting light exposure as soon as you get up, and it's a little bit past dawn, so the light intensity is sufficient, you can treat winter depression that way. Is indoor light sufficiently bright? No. What about window light? Again, the inverse square law. If you're right up against the window, the sunlight is streaming in, your nose is pressed up against the window like you were looking in the candy shop, then it might be bright enough. But as soon as you back off a few inches from the window, that light intensity is falling off dramatically. So for a few weeks in the winter at some places of sufficient latitude, you'll need a portable light fixture to treat winter depression. Give the light exposure in the morning immediately upon awakening, 1 to 2 hours of 2500 lux. If you want to use 10,000 lux, you could use maybe 30 minutes to 45 minutes. Remember, your working patients are going to have to get up earlier to use the light exposure, and I'm going to show you a little bit about why that may interfere. So if you start on the weekend, then they can get up earlier and get the light exposure and get started that way. You should start seeing the response in a few days, and it should be complete within 2 weeks. If the patients have to get up significantly earlier to get the morning light, then it may take a little bit longer. These patients should minimize getting up earlier as much as they could and avoid bright light exposure in the evening. If they don't respond, it may be because they need a longer duration of morning light or slightly more intense. If they start to respond and then seem to not go any further, that probably indicates they need more morning light. But if they respond and then seem to relapse, if they respond and then complain that they're waking up before the light and they're getting very tired in the evening, then you may have given them too much morning light. You've overly phase advanced them, in which case you want to back off and give them a little bit less morning light. You can titrate this and play with this. You're not going to lose the response like some reports of antidepressant treatment in non-seasonal. If you lose the response, you can always get it back with these patients. There are a few evening light responders. So if you've really given the morning light a due trial, proper course, then try evening light. You might have one of those rare evening light responders, and then they should, of course, avoid bright light exposure in the morning. You should take an eye history. Do they have normal eyes? They have the lens present. They're not aphakic. You should ask them some questions. We don't really examine the eyes of every person we do light therapy on. There are some research studies with the 10,000 lux intensity where they're doing exams before and after. So far, I believe they've not come up with any damage. And of course, they should never stare directly at the sun, and they should not use ultraviolet light or infrared light. We recommend fluorescent light. Cool white fluorescent light is the safest light, with a plexiglass diffuser over it to not only make it a kind of a blank area of light, not a pinpoint source, but also to absorb any possible ultraviolet. Well, I'd like to switch over now to some other circadian phase disorders. There are two types of sleep disorders. The delayed type, these people have trouble falling asleep before 2 or 3 in the morning. If they have their druthers, sleep until noon. If not, they'll make up their sleep debt on the weekend. So sleep onset time is a more reliable way of assessing this disorder, not sleep offset time. That occurs mainly in younger people. And then in older people, they have more of the opposite problem, the phase advanced type of disorder. Tuckering out at 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, they'll wake up 3 in the morning, can't go back to sleep. They're not depressed, they just have a phase advanced clock and therefore phase advanced sleep. So we treat the phase delay people with morning light and the phase advanced people with evening light, scheduling it a few minutes earlier or later each day until they're moved in the appropriate phase. Moving on to the treatment of jet lag. We use the phase response curve, and nature has it that the phase response curve is situated such that we can make good use of sunlight exposure for treating jet lag. If you're flying from Philadelphia to the West Coast, you'll want to get light at the end of the day. That will hit your delay portion of your light PRC. And what you want to do is delay your clock 3 hours. And when you fly back here, you want to get morning light, which will hit the advanced portion of your PRC and will help you advance 3 hours. But if you're flying from the West Coast to continental Europe, morning light is now going to be on your West Coast evening. So you want to get light in the middle of the day. You want to avoid it in the morning. If you get light on the delay portion, you'll delay your clock through 15 time zones going the opposite direction rather than advancing your clock 9 time zones, the direction you happen to be actually traveling. And we've actually tested this. Measuring the body temperature rhythm showed that it delayed and didn't entrain in the one if you got light in the morning in Holland, but if you got it in the middle of the day, it advanced very nicely. We jet lag every week. Well, some of us who don't have strict, good schedules where we stay up late Friday night, sleep in Saturday morning, stay up Saturday night even later, sleep in even later Sunday morning. Then Sunday night comes around, we want to go to bed early to get our full 8 hours, and we have a prolonged sleep latency because we have let our 25-hour clock delay a couple hours over the weekend. And you can prevent this with morning light, particularly on Sunday, so that you can fall asleep earlier Sunday night. Now, I want to talk about blind people for a minute. The free-running sleep rhythm of a sighted person in a bunker or cave will be on our 25-hour clock, going to bed an hour later each day, getting up an hour later each day. After 24 days, we'll wrap around and be going to bed at the same time as our compatriots living in the real world, but then we're still drifting an hour later each day. Now, blind people, totally blind people, they're about 10 or 15% of the legally blind. They have absolutely no light perception. They push their sleep rhythm into the socially acceptable time, but their melatonin rhythm drifts, peaking during the day in a blind person at noon, a week later at 6 p.m., a week after that at 10 p.m., a week after that at 2 in the morning. There still is this off phase of 12 hours and on phase, but it's drifting about an hour later each day. On these days, the patient is asymptomatic. 2 weeks later, when this person's out of phase completely, he's sleepy during the day, can't sleep at night, and has some mood disturbances. Nothing affects the melatonin rhythm here in these totally blind people, but the internal clock that's very precise. This person has a tau or periodicity of 24.70. The cortisol nadir free runs exactly with the melatonin onset. All circadian rhythms, I think, are controlled by the same clock. There are 11 people showing the range in tau going from one person who actually had a shorter than 24-hour tau of 23.86. Most of them range between 24.28 and 25.08. And so these people were probably the larks in society, and these are the owls. Sighted people would have the same range if we were in a bunker. But within an individual, there's no change. If we take an individual and come back a year or two later and study them, we get very precise similar taus as previously studied, 25.07 versus 25.06. 2 hours after your melatonin goes up, you feel sleepy. Does that mean melatonin's making you sleepy? I don't think so. It's just a marker for the clock, and the clock is saying the sleep time should occur 2 hours after your melatonin onset. Now, this precise movement of the clock a little bit later each day is characterized by the following. If we bring a blind person in and their melatonin onset's at 7, and then bring them in 13 later and determine that it's at 5, and then bring them in 15 days after that and determine it's at 1, 14 days after that, determine that it's at 7:30. We can draw a straight line through that and predict that the next onset, if we bring that person back 21 days later, is going to be at 8:30 at night. And if we determine it bang, hits it right on the target, it will be at 8:30 at night. That's how precise this rhythm is. That means we can give drugs to these people, and if there's any change in the predicted time, in the actual time from prediction, we know that the drug is changing the time of the clock. And what drug did we choose to study? Well, of course, it was melatonin per se, because in animals there were certain studies that show that melatonin could also cause phase shifts in the clock. So we are now treating people not only with light, not just blind people, but sighted people with melatonin. Several months study showing the melatonin onsets and cortisol nadirs free running. Then we gave 5 milligrams PO of melatonin for 3 weeks at bedtime, and we caused a phase advance. So melatonin has robust phase resetting effects in blind people. Well, what about sighted people? Well, in our first study of sighted people, we were studying mainly males because the FDA wouldn't let us give melatonin to females of childbearing potential. And we cut the dose down now to a physiological dose, 0.5 milligrams. And we obtained a melatonin onset at the end of the baseline week and at the end of a melatonin administration week, 4 days of melatonin administration. On average, the melatonin onset goes up at 9 o'clock if you're getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's 14 hours later. Circadian rhythm tradition says that the time you get up in the morning and get light exposure is your zero time on your clock. So 14 hours later is circadian time 14. Give you some examples. Here's the average time of melatonin, 9 o'clock, 2100 military time. We're giving melatonin, say, at 1800. We call this CT14, circadian time 14. That means we were giving melatonin 3 hours earlier at CT11. The next subject got melatonin at the same clock time, but he's an owl, and his melatonin is naturally going up at 2300. So he's getting exogenous melatonin treatment 5 hours ahead of that, or at CT9, because this is always CT14. And this lark, whose melatonin is going up at 1900, is getting 1800 administration 1 hour before, so they're getting it at CT13. So in these three individuals who are all getting melatonin at 6 o'clock in the evening are getting melatonin at 3 different circadian times. So it's not the clock time that's important when you give melatonin, it's the circadian internal clock time. This is also true for light, by the way, but it's a little more complicated, as you'll see, when it comes to melatonin. So we may now be able to use bright light and melatonin together. It may be best to know what the person's endogenous clock time is. Generally, we can predict it on the basis of the sleep time. If their sleep is early, we might give the melatonin and the light a little earlier than if their sleep time was later. The light PRC and the melatonin PRC look identical, except that they're 12 hours out of phase with each other. That should not be surprising, because melatonin is the chemical essence of darkness. So it's acting like a dark pulse. It's made only at night in the dark. And that tells us how to treat people with both light and melatonin. If you want to phase advance somebody, you give them light in the morning or melatonin in the afternoon. Morning light makes dawn earlier. That shifts the clock earlier. Melatonin in the afternoon makes dusk earlier. That shifts the clock earlier. If you take melatonin in the afternoon, even though it's light out, it tricks the clock into thinking that it's dusk. If you want to phase delay somebody, you give them evening light or morning melatonin. You give melatonin in the morning, and even though the sun's starting to rise, the clock still thinks it's dark out. You're making dawn later, you make the clock later. So just like the two strands of DNA and the structure of DNA were very important in understanding genetics, the fact that the light PRC and the melatonin PRC are 12 hours out of phase, are opposite to each other, if you will, helps us understand how the whole circadian system works in humans. Now, if we shuffle these up a little bit, we see the following complementarities. The light during the day hits the dead zone of the light PRC. The melatonin at night hits the dead zone of the melatonin PRC. The time when the light PRC is most sensitive to light is where there's no light. The time that the melatonin PRC is most sensitive to melatonin is where there's no melatonin. Remember, you don't make melatonin during the day, even though you go into a cave or a dark room. So the times where the PRC is sensitive and the stimulus is sufficiently intense are at the twilight transitions. As morning light comes up, it hits the advanced zone of the light PRC. As the late afternoon light diminishes, it's hitting the delay zone of the light PRC. So you bobble back and forth between an advance and a delay each day, and that keeps you centered at 24 hours each day. And the same is true for melatonin. As melatonin levels rise in the evening, they hit the advanced zone of the melatonin PRC. As they decline in the morning, they hit the delay zone of the melatonin PRC. And so you're bobbling back and forth between the melatonin signal. So the melatonin signal serves to augment the light. It's a secondary backup system. That's our theory for the function of melatonin in humans. And it relates to the suppressant effect of light. This is how we got started in this whole thing. And the way they work together is as follows. In nature, the suppressant effect of light, that is, the only time there's really bright enough light, is at the twilight transitions, where it could possibly affect melatonin production. So it truncates the melatonin profile, causing a later onset and an earlier offset. And that removes melatonin from stimulating key portions of the melatonin phase response curve. We have the direct entrainment effect of light on the SCN. One of the rhythms is the pineal production of melatonin. Receptors on the SCN have been identified and now cloned for melatonin. There is also this unique effect of suppressing melatonin of light, truncating or narrowing the melatonin signal. At any given time of the day, melatonin is going to cause the opposite phase shift as light. So how do you have two systems work together that oppose each other? You've got a double negative here. Light also suppresses this system. So by suppressing this opposition, the suppressant effect of light enhances the entrainment effect of light. So there's both an indirect and direct way of entraining the clock. Suppose you are a cave woman huntress, and you normally get up at 7, but now it's summer and the light is up at 5 in the morning, and there's a particularly good crepuscular animal that you like to eat that's going to be good to hunt for a week. And you want to get up at 5 in the morning. So you ask your cave husband to stay outside the cave all night, and at the crack of dawn, bring you out at 5 in the morning to get 2 hours earlier light exposure. Now what's that going to do? 2 hours earlier light exposure is going to give you light more on the advanced portion of the light PRC. That's going to help you advance, which is great. It's also going to cut off melatonin production 2 hours earlier, thereby removing melatonin from stimulating the delay portion of the melatonin PRC. You remove a delay, you also get an advance. So you get an advance directly through the light, and you get an advance by removing the delaying effect of melatonin. And that's how we think the two systems work together. So we've come up with this theory that one possible function for melatonin production is to augment entrainment of the circadian pacemaker by the light-dark cycle. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that Light treatment certainly works well in treating circadian phase disorders. We think that winter depression is a circadian phase disorder. There's some controversy about that. You may hear a little bit of a different point of view from Dr. Rosenthal later on. I want you to get all the points of view today. We think melatonin may one day replace light because it works just as well in causing shifts, but it's more convenient. It's a lot easier to take a pill that has virtually no side effects than it is to sit in front of a light box. But perhaps the two together will be used to treat most people. These parameters need to be worked out.
To conclude, some remarks from a question and discussion period.
Well, your circadian rhythms begin right after birth. Your clock is working at birth, maybe even before birth. In fact, the melatonin from the mother, either through the placenta or their breast milk, is probably timing the child's rhythms. But then you're free running, as your mothers and fathers know. You're free running for several weeks, and probably the myelination of the RHT is occurring at that point. And then as you get the light-dark information, you become entrained. For people with winter depression, I recommend they get off shift work. I really have not been able to figure out how to treat a winter depressive night worker. I really write them a letter. You know, if somebody has a mood disturbance on shift work, that they need to stop shift work. For people who basically just have problems with shift work, adapting to the schedules, very easy to treat them. Sometimes all they need are sunglasses in the morning so that they don't get the light exposure in the morning, which prevents them from making their phase shift. Sometimes you want to schedule light exposure during the night for them, but I think melatonin treatment is probably going to be the treatment of choice for the shift worker. By getting up earlier, say, you're now getting more morning light, and that's keeping your clock advanced. But basically, for winter depressives, you need the light treatment all winter long. Maybe not every day, maybe not even every other day. But if you stop it for several days, your depression comes back. You reinstitute light therapy, and it goes away again. So you can titrate yourself all winter depending on how it goes, but it will come back. Class, what time would you give melatonin to treat SAD? Right, afternoon. We gave afternoon versus morning melatonin in a double-blind crossover, and it does work. But they don't get as well as with light, and we think the reason is that there's this huge placebo component, at least in the studies, with the light exposure. And we've completely gotten rid of that placebo component with just taking the pill. But we do find that the afternoon melatonin works better than the morning melatonin. So it confirms our phase shift hypothesis and perhaps will be useful as a treatment. Melatonin's effect you see the first day. In our study, we only looked 4 days after melatonin, but one of my colleagues from Lyon presented a paper recently showing that the very first day you get melatonin, you see that phase shift. Availability, I checked out a health food store near my hotel, and they have plenty of melatonin. They were selling one brand for $11 and another brand for $20, and they were identical. So I asked him what the difference is, and he said, oh, this company's much better company. I'd recommend the more expensive melatonin, and it's identical stuff. It's sold at a 3 milligram dose, which is higher than our 0.5 milligram dose. I asked him, what's it good for? He said, it's great for sleep. I said, when do you take it? He said, oh, take it 15 minutes before bedtime. Well, you know that to get the phase shifting effect, you need to take it in the middle of the day. If we were treating somebody with a delayed sleep phase disorder, we'd give it in the afternoon so as to advance the time they naturally feel sleepy. Over the next few days, they'll be sleeping 2 or 3 hours earlier. He also told me it was good for breast cancer and some other things. So I don't think that the FDA is going to let it stay on the health. This stuff about melatonin, this research is so new. First of all, it's a hormone. I don't know if any hormones are being sold in health food stores. Secondly, it's a potent drug. And although it's safe, I mean, it's very safe, you can still cause a phase shift in the opposite direction as desired if you take it at the wrong time. And I don't think the health food stores are going to get their acts together to give that kind of information. They're going to require clinicians to prescribe it after listening to a patient's story and giving them the correct directions on taking it, because it could be harmful to induce jet lag. Somebody gets into a car accident because their rhythms are all screwed up or something like that. I don't think I want to be a health food store owner having that kind of liability hanging over me. The health food stores are getting it from a couple of companies. There are at least 2 or 3 that are selling it to the health food stores. I'm in the process right now of trying to get a pharmaceutical company to market melatonin, a real pharmaceutical company that's going to go through the FDA like I have with all approved research protocols, have a pharmaceutical company go through the FDA and get it completely tested for safety and oncological studies and more research for the exact best way to give melatonin, and hopefully I will be able to convince a drug company to do that, but I haven't as yet. Can you suppress melatonin other than light? And yes, if you give a beta blocker, you can suppress melatonin. Give it at bedtime, you give a beta blocker. But remember, we're going to ask this question. We're not impugning melatonin as the culprit here in any of these disorders. We're just using it as a marker for the clock. I may be changing my mind in a few years with future research, but we're still looking at melatonin strictly as a marker, and so we would not be treating anybody with beta blockers, except I should add that Dr. Schlager in Long Island is giving winter depressives a beta blocker in the morning, 80 milligrams or so, cutting off melatonin in the morning, which would cause a phase advance because, just like morning light, getting rid of the melatonin in the morning might do it, and he's got some interesting results. For treating shift workers who are working at night, we give 0.5 milligrams about just before they're ready to leave home. It's around 6 or 7 in the morning for most people. And then when they're ready to go back on their off-work days, we give it around 7 or 8 at night. That's the general rule. You may have somebody that's a lark or an owl where you have to adjust the time of that by a few hours, but that's the general way it works. The receptors for melatonin have been identified in humans, and the receptor was recently cloned, and we are going to see an explosion of research now that they can clone the receptor, they can make drugs now. There are several companies that are patenting analogs of melatonin. They're patenting the composition of matter and are going to be testing them as a way of treating chronobiologic disorders. One of the effects of melatonin in certain species, and this formed the early bioassays, was to blanch skin. And in humans or mammals, this effect is retained only in the retinal pigmented epithelium. Melatonin derives its name both from serotonin and melanin, and it counteracts the effect of melanin in certain species. And so in the RPE, there are melatonin receptors also, and that's another way that melatonin interacts with the light-dark cycle. We've done some work in Alzheimer's disease, and our first patient was spectacular. Well, as you know, in Alzheimer's disease, it's rare that a person is awake or asleep continuously for more than 60 minutes at a time. I mean, they have a completely erratic and chaotic sleep-wake cycle. And so we thought, how perfect, we'll give melatonin at night for this person and they won't have it during the day. And they slept real well. The first person slept real well at night and was very alert during the day. And then we did 3 more Alzheimer's patients and it had no effect. So we're going to pursue it. Maybe we're not doing it quite right, but maybe we need to combine it with light or propranolol. But we'll work on it. Cloudy days obviously psychologically has some kind of effect that I can't measure. Cloudy days is going to interact with the day length in the following way. If it's real cloudy in the morning, it will effectively make dawn later. So if you had several days where it's cloudy in the morning, you might see an increase in winter depression because the light intensity is not high enough at the right time. They're getting up in the dark, and they need to get up with the light being brighter earlier. So that's one way that it could. But that's the only. Cloudiness in the middle of the day should not have an effect on true winter depressive symptoms. Chronic fatigue syndrome, to look at that. It has not been studied. We hope to perhaps do a study in that. There is a link between low melatonin levels and depression. And of course, propranolol causes depression in some people, and it may be mediated through suppressing melatonin production.
Thank you, Dr. Lewy. Audio Digest Psychiatry is produced twice each month by the Audio Digest Foundation, a nonprofit subsidiary of the California Medical Association. This tape is copyright 1994.